We're rolling in.
Good.
I love it. Happy Thursday.
Hey guys. Evan, am I on here?
Yeah, you are.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just you and I.
Oh, it's just us.
It's just us right now in terms of the video.
Okay, good. So good. Shit. Okay. Okay, so I opened up a little chat over here.
And you can click participants, and then you can see everyone
cool.
tuning in.
Oh, we got him. Look.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. Hey, Peniel.
Hey, what's up? I was on or trying to get on.
Oh.
Yeah. No worries. We have everyone here now, so I'm glad we were able to make it.
Okay, cool.
All right, we'll give everyone a minute here. We would love for, as you join, go ahead and drop a message in the chat section. Make sure you select all panelists and attendees. Maybe let us know where you're from. Say hello to Amy and Peniel. We have 50 people.
Oh, here we go.
Chicago. Can you see it, Amy?
I got it. Yeah. So am I live right now?
Yes.
Can people hear me? Can you guys
hear me? Hear you. I can
hear
you. Yes. Okay, cool. It's great to see everybody and where everybody is coming in from. I love that. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to everybody who's here right now. It's really, really cool. I just think it's just so special when you throw something out there, you don't know how many people are going to jump on board, and so many of you have, and we're so grateful. So
absolutely. All right, we'll give it maybe one more minute. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of our members and of course our panelists today. I know everyone is busy, and yet you chose to be here and participate with us, and we don't take that lightly, I can assure you. Hiitide and our partners, we spend a lot of time trying to create these learning experiences that have transformative potential. I believe ultimately that we find our definition of ourselves not by confrontations with reality so much as other minds. We are shaped by each other. My hope with Hiitide, and particularly experiences like this, is that we can help our community transcend conversations, people, places that comprise our past to learn new perspectives and meet new people that help us all live a little bit better. And it's people like Amy Purdy, a walking inspiration for walking inspirations, who's willing to pause everything she had going on to lean in and create this space for all of us to learn and grow safely. And Dr. Joseph, who takes time out of his busy schedule at the University of Austin, Texas, and writing award-winning books, who has spent his career earning the insights that he'll share with us tonight. So in a few minutes, Dr. Joseph will lead us through a discussion for about 30 minutes or so. And then he and Amy will engage in an open Q&A. But if you have any questions at any point throughout this discussion, please feel free to share them in the chat. Make sure, again, you select all attendees and panelists, and we'll be able to see those. But before we begin, Amy, did you have a few words you wanted to say before Dr. Joseph dives in?
Yes, for sure. I mean, first of all, I just want to say once again, thank you to everybody who took time out of your day to be here. It means so much to us. I also want to say thank you to my team at Hiitide and Evan. These guys have worked so hard. When we decided that this is what we wanted to do, they have worked around the clock ever since we started this, and they've pulled together such an incredible workshop for us. So I am curious with you guys, if you're enjoying the workshop so far, if you've been able to check it out, if you've done some of the journal entries, and if so, if you just maybe give us a word over here in the chat section and let us know how you're enjoying it so far. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading your journal entries. I spent an hour this morning entering my own journal entries after watching Just Mercy for a second time. I'm also reading the book. And I really wanted to do this because, you know, I think like most of us, when, you know, weeks ago, when we watched George Floyd die on live TV, it still gets me. Like, it hit me viscerally. And I avoided watching it because I knew that was going to happen. And then I forced myself to watch it. And it was the first time that I really felt something so deep and a bit of an understanding maybe of what other people are faced with, and why they can why there is so much anger against this, and because I felt angry myself. And so I just felt like, you know, what can we do? I don't want to just read a book. And if you're like me, you don't retain anything. I don't retain anything. I read a book and I'm like so motivated and totally ready to take action. And then I get distracted with real life. And then I completely forget what I was doing. And I didn't, you know, do anything. And I think right now there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of, you know, people are saying, read these books, watch these shows, do these different things, that you actually get somewhat paralyzed in the decision-making process and you end up doing nothing. And I didn't want to do that myself. I thought, I want to do something where I know that I'm educating myself and helping to be a part of the problem. Sorry, definitely not a part of the problem, a part of the solution other than being a part of the problem. So how do I do that? And so that's why we wanted to do this, and we wanted to bring those of you who are open to it along with us. So I got so emotional, but like, it just, that's how much it, you know, it really hit me. And I want to make sure I'm educated in this area. And I'm kind of willing to help. I'm willing to do it live with all of you guys. So anyway, so thank you guys so much. And also, just by you guys being here, we're already making quite a bit of change. I mean, we were just talking about, I think we've raised over $4,000 through this, which is incredible. So we're already taking that actionable step of educating ourselves and then also helping to make a difference. So you guys are doing that. So thank you. So that's all I have to say for right now.
Thank you so much, Amy. So Dr. Joseph, if you'd like to go ahead and take it away for a little bit here.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Amy. My name is Peniel Joseph. You know, I teach at the University of Texas at Austin, and I've been teaching a graduate seminar on mass incarceration for the past 5 years. Just Mercy is one of the books that I teach. So I've read Just Mercy maybe 10 times. I've cried each time as well. I read it when it was in hardback when it came out in 2012. I think Bryan Stevenson is an American hero in the mold of Martin Luther King Jr. and human rights activist. I've seen the film. I think it's a brilliant film. What I want to talk about really is this idea of building the beloved community through reading something like Just Mercy. And when I say the beloved community, that's a word and a phrase that Martin Luther King Jr. Often used. And what he meant by that was a community that was free of racial injustice, a community that was free of poverty and misery and violence, and just the mistreatment of any citizen. I think one of the things that we're all facing as a country now, we're about to head towards July 4th. And really a couple of weeks ago, for the first time, we all commemorated Juneteenth, which is really, I'm in Austin, Texas, and that is a tradition that started in the African-American community in Galveston, Texas. And they were among the last to find out that the Civil War had ended and slavery had ended and there was freedom. And starting in 1866, there became annual celebrations in Texas. And Black people in Houston even purchased 5 acres of land in what is now Emancipation Park, a public park, to celebrate the end of racial slavery. And so I think that we're all, in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, is really, and it's more than a death. I mean, it's a murder, it's a public execution. That has really galvanized all of us, even for people like me who do this work. And so what I'd like to talk about is really, on some levels, when we think about Just Mercy, for those of us who are reading the book, there are names like Walter McMillan, Herbert Richardson, who's on death row, the young boy Charlie, who was tried as an adult and tortured and sexually assaulted in prison, Trina Garnett, the young Black woman who eventually is in a wheelchair and is sexually assaulted by guards and has her baby taken away from her, Ian Manuel, the teenager, Latinx, no parole, Antonio Nunez, George Daniel, who has mental illness, Avery Jenkins, who only wants the chocolate milkshake from Brian, and very, very sweet part. The white guard who has the Confederate flag, and I'll talk about monuments, but then who Brian and him have a moment after he's heard about all the negative things that's happened to Avery, and he had been a foster child too, and he bonds with Brian Stevenson after having given him a humiliating body search in one of his visits to his client, Avery. Marsha Colby, who's white, and who white people are obviously as well victims of injustice in this country. Disproportionately, it's Black and people of color, but white people as well, who has a stillborn baby but serves 10 years in prison. And that's a really beautiful story and vignette. Walter McMillan is the main part of the book. Joe Sullivan is the juvenile inmate who is sexually assaulted and has multiple sclerosis, and who is on a first grade reading level. And you know, this is stuff that can, you know, would make you cry. Brian Stevenson calls life in prison sentences, death in prison sentences. The work he's done on May 17, 2010, Supreme Court said that life sentences for juveniles in non-homicide cases were unconstitutional. By 2012, the Supreme Court said they put a constitutional ban on mandatory life without parole sentences on juveniles convicted of homicide, so we could think about the impact that his work has had. The release of Angola prisoners, teen Black prisoners who had been in jail for 45, 50 years, some of them blind. This is really torture, cruel and inhumane. Walter McMillan dies in 2013. So even though he's released, he gets a few $100,000, but he really lives a diminished life based on the trauma that he faces. And then finally, you know, one of the things that he says, and I'll get back to this, Brian Stevenson says, we need more hope, we need more mercy, we need more justice. And those are really the things I want to talk about, because I think that whatever your political persuasion, with the demonstrations since May 25th have been about, are really that. It's saying that, you know, in the context of Juneteenth and the 4th of July, for all this country's hopes and boasts, it's never been truly free. And why is that? And so when we think about our history, a lot of what we're facing in 2020, when it comes to Confederate monuments, when it comes to flags, when it comes to the criminal justice system, it's really facing our history. And I think Brian Stevenson does it in a beautiful way. I think the film does it in a beautiful way. But it's like Amy was saying, part of what we have to do is really be empowered by this history. And what I want to do is talk about some of that history. And again, for those of us who are Americans, this is history that we should have known, irrespective of race, because this is our nation. But even those of us who are immigrants and those of us who are not Americans, Dr. King famously talked about the World House. And what Dr. King meant by the World House was that he said we were all mutually interconnected in what he called a single garment of destiny, meaning that we all have fundamental human rights that go beyond citizenship, that go beyond borders and boundaries, that go beyond race, class, gender, sexuality, non-binary, all of it, right? And so when we're thinking about just mercy, in my mind, we have to think about our history and that how that history connects us in this sort of interwoven web of humanity, but how that history has triumphs, which we usually talk about: American exceptionalism, first Black president, all these positives, which we should talk about, but we never talk about the negatives, right? Dr. King said in 1967, when he was coming out against the Vietnam War, to transform America, it was going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle. We always talk about the beauty, but not the bitter. And I think one of the things that Just Mercy does, in a way, that scales down that history in a way that we can comprehend, because he's doing it through narrative. He lets us identify with individuals who we come to care about, which is why we cry both during and after the end of reading this book. But each of those individuals is tethered to a larger story. And that larger history, it's connected to Tulsa and the Tulsa racial massacre of 1921. It's connected to convict lease system. And we can talk about this in Q&A, but the convict lease system was right after slavery, right after Juneteenth, when we really had a chance to achieve our country and have interracial democracy, no racial segregation, nobody mistreated, nobody more equal than the other. We did the exact opposite. We set up a system that criminalized, that incarcerated, that punished Black people, that has continued even though there are Black people who have escaped that system. And the people who've escaped include people like Bryan Stevenson, even though he talks about the confrontations that he's faced with the police, people like Michelle and Barack Obama, even though everybody who's Black who I know has some story of something that's happened to them connected to being thought of as somebody who they were not, suspected of some kind of crime that they had nothing to do with, profiled while maybe shopping or driving or just jogging in their own neighborhoods, right? And what we have to understand is that that is connected to this deeper history, right? And so a lot of the ways in which people are acting right now, it's connected to a history that's much deeper and expansive than all of us. And the only way we can understand it and not get mad at each other, not get angry, not accuse and have recriminations is to say, why is this happening right now in America and the world? Why are 2,000 different cities are saying Black Lives Matter, you know? Is there a reason? And when we see and read Just Mercy, but then when we understand American history, this is not just Black American history, this is American history, this is all of us. You see that these systems that were set up during racial slavery, unfortunately for us, did not die out after slavery. They evolved. They went into different modes and modalities, and the criminal justice system is one of them, but there's a number of different things. People talk about redlining and the fact that we have racial segregation in housing and public schools, even with the Brown decision. Black people weren't allowed to have land after slavery. You know, Spike Lee's production company is called 40 Acres and a Mule because that was the promise. But that promise was not fulfilled. When we think about Dr. King and the March on Washington speech, August 28, 1963, he says, "We come to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the great vaults of opportunity in America are bankrupt." That's what King says. So part of the problem that we're facing is an inability to squarely confront that history. Very quickly, what happens if we confront that history? If we confront that history, South Africa had to do this too, truth and reconciliation. If we have those brave conversations, what we're gonna do is a few things. One, we have to admit what happened. We have to admit that there are all these thousands of policies in the United States that, whether we're gonna say they're intentional or unintentional, have produced racial inequality. So they are racist policies. Not only do we have to get rid of those in the criminal justice system and every facet of our society, we have to commit ourselves to anti-racism. We have to say that we don't want to see discrimination and inequality in any facet of our lives, our companies, our networks. And we have to center racial justice and not think that this is an add-on. If you are an environmental activist, you should be centering racial justice. If you are an activist for women's rights, you should be centering racial justice. If you are a business leader and entrepreneur, you should be centering anti-racism and racial justice. What Bryan Stevenson teaches us, and not only has he done this extraordinary work through the Equal Justice Initiative, which we're raising money for, but also the African American Memorial that he has set up in Alabama. In Alabama, the cradle of the Confederacy, he's doing this work in Alabama that really documents the over 4,000 African American women and men who were lynched in the United States in American history. And that's our history. Like, we have to confront that history. And I think this idea of just mercy, this idea, what Bryan Stevenson argues is that all of us deserve this unmerited grace. We deserve this unmerited mercy, this compassion. We've treated our Black citizens without that compassion really since the birth of the Republic. And that has continued. And George Floyd did not receive that compassion. The reason why we cry over Floyd is because we're saying, look, this is somebody's daddy. This is somebody's brother. This is somebody his partner. This person matters, you know? Even if a person makes a mistake, in our country, the penalty should not be death, right? If there's a mistaken identity, the penalty should not be death. It should not be shoot first, ask questions later. So I think what I'll say, and just with this last few minutes, is that what's so important for us about Just Mercy is the way in which, in addition to policy changes and transformations that we need deep empathy for each other. We need to educate ourselves. We need allyship, and especially white allyship, that thinks about Black children the same way they think about their own children. I think what's extraordinary about reading Equal Justice, the film was great, but the film didn't get to do all the vignettes that Brian does in the book, right? So I gave you the list of names. There's maybe 20 different people he meets, including young boys, young girls, white people, Latinx, African American. And what he does such a great job of doing is bring those characters to life. So even though many of the characters make a mistake, nobody's, some of them are innocent in the way that we love the person who's untarnished, but he's saying that even those who are not innocent deserve our compassion. And we know this. We treat our children with this. We don't throw away our children when they make mistakes. We don't throw away family when they make mistakes. Even when they do heinous things, we love them and we forgive them, and we want them to have grace, and we want them to have mercy, and we want institutions to treat them the same way, right? And so in this country, we have not done that. I mean, one big, very short example is the opioid crisis versus crack cocaine. Opioid crisis was predominantly white, and those white folks were treated with mercy, and I think they should have been. Crack cocaine was also a health crisis, and those Black people, many of them, hundreds of thousands, are still in prison right now. And communities were raised, and it was not viewed as a mental or physical healthcare crisis. So we have so much work to do, and I think the reason why Bryan Stevenson is such this global hero in this time, he allows us to go beyond stereotypes, beyond any kind of resistance that we might have, to find out about these young people's stories, including he has one young man's story about having shot his victim, a white woman, who then over time comes to know him, forgives him, and actually wants him to have a prison reduction. So we're seeing a system that disallows for empathy. So when we think about things like restorative justice, when we think about these things, we see examples where she wants him out of jail, a reduced sentence, and he can't be released. So my final word is the beloved community. The beloved community. What I think Bryan Stevenson brings us all closer towards is this idea of a beloved community, but it's one that is not just about hugs and kisses and we're all going to get along without transforming ourselves. It means a redistribution of justice, and that means a redistribution of power, but it also means, like he's done, a real redistribution of empathy. One of the great things he talks about is being a stone catcher. He talks about the African-American man who tells him, you know what you're doing, you know what you're doing. And he's getting really, he's like, what is this person talking about? And he's saying, you're marching, you know, you're beating the drum for justice, you know, and that's what Bryan Stevenson is doing. And we should all be doing at this time. And my final word is that I think that just like Amy, this book and the movie has moved me very much. And I think tears are really good. And part of the reason why there's so much violence in this world is that we don't cry enough, especially men. Men are the biggest purveyors of violence in the world. And we know that through the data. So all the men out there, I'm not saying it based on gender, I'm saying all the data shows. That's what I'm saying. It's like the data shows us this. And so if we cried more, a lot of times we wouldn't do the toxic masculinity game and punch people in the face or do whatever craziness, especially young men are prone to do. And so he cracks open our hearts and lets us lead with vulnerability and compassion. And if we're gonna be anti-racist, if we're gonna, this 4th of July, say that we're 1 year closer to really making that holiday mean freedom and independence and liberty for all people, right? For all people. We have to be deeply empathetic on our way to building that beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about in achieving our country. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Joseph. That was incredible. Amy, I want to make sure we can dive into some of the questions that we had discussed. Why don't you go ahead and
Yeah.
take the lead there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to write down some questions actually
Yeah.
as you were speaking, and thank you so much. Everything that you just shared is incredible, and just there's so much to think about, and you realize just how deep all of this goes. So I just want to hit a couple questions here, and then we'll open it up to everybody else as well. But one of the questions is, so how much of our prison system is a mental health issue, and what's set up, because I know there are programs that are set up to help with mental health issues. There's therapists out there in different programs, but what could be done better?
Yeah, that's a great question, Amy. A lot. We went from 300,000 people in prison to 2.3 million between 1970 and 2010. A lot of this has to do with the fact that we've divested from funding mental health, neighborhoods, housing, anti-poverty, basic income for all people. And we invested in a criminal justice system where now we have 800,000 police, 18,000 police departments, and their job has been expanded greatly over the last 50 years. So it's not just the job of fighting crime, it is a job connected to homelessness. It's confronting, they're the first responders for everything but a fire. And so one of the biggest things we could do is think about just nationally, and private philanthropy too, but our nation, is what are we going to invest in? And I think one of the main things we'd have to do is invest in desegregation, because one of the reasons why everything from mental health, poverty, our public schools are in shambles is because racial segregation continues in the United States. And when we think about segregation, segregation is how we can have some communities that are thriving and people do have access to these therapists. They have access to diversionary programs. They have access to things that we all need. And I'm a dad. I've got a 3, but a 5-year-old, 12, 15. But it's really connected to, like, if you want organic vegetables for yourself, but for no one else. My daughter loves to eat organic vegetables because she sees daddy eating them, right? Love to do yoga in the morning. We all have our wellness fitness routines, but shouldn't everybody have access to that, where we can all, swim, we can all do the things we need? But what we see is that we have these pockets of prosperity all throughout the United States, and we have these huge chasms of poverty that are really racially segregated and economically just sort of unequal. And so if we could transform that, David Brooks talks about this in some of his stuff now too, the weavers and the caretakers and communities that stop violence. Mental health is a big part of this. Brian Stevenson says in Just Mercy, 50% of people who are in prison have some kind of emotional health issue that was certainly not being treated outside of prison and is not being treated inside prison. So mental health, and I think we need, Amy, more than just hospitals. If we had healthcare for everyone, I think everyone needs access the same way all of us want to get healthcare. I want to see the therapist from the HBO series In Treatment, Paul. That's who I want to see. I want to see Gabriel Byrne, sit down and I'm going to hang out with him. And I love the wood paneling in Gabriel Byrne's house. So all of us should have that access. And I truly believe that. We all matter and we should all have that access. And if we did, certainly we wouldn't just have our prisons being filled with people who really need help, but have been incarcerated instead.
I think that's something that we don't always see. If you don't see it, you don't know what the rest of the world or country is dealing with. So, it's easy for me to say, oh yeah, there's programs, there's therapists, like everybody has access to that. But really what you're saying is what we don't see is that there are these pockets that it is not that easy for multiple reasons to have access to that type of support and help. And right, I'm assuming that's right.
No, absolutely. And again, I always say segregation because communities, unfortunately, we have racial and economic segregation. And so communities that are thriving tend to be, and all the data shows us this, overwhelmingly white. And those are communities where you don't have food deserts, where you have playgrounds and parks that are not overly surveilled or policed, where you can go to the mall, you can go to the doctor, you can bike ride around the neighborhoods. I live in one right here in Austin, Texas, and that's what everyone should have access to, those kind of resources. And so if we integrate both our neighborhoods, our resources together, we're not going to have the wrong side of tracks, the wrong side of town, even if we have different incomes in those towns. That's what we're saying. So we're saying that you can have places where there are disparities in income. That doesn't mean it's disparities in life chances.
And that actually goes into my next question, which is, how much of it is a race issue and how much of it is a poverty issue? Yeah. Because clearly, like you mentioned, I mean, there's people of all races who are living in poverty and also don't have access to some of these resources. So when you really look at that, like watching Just Mercy, you can look at that and say, yes, they had, primarily Black people on death row, but they also had a lot of poor people who couldn't afford to fight their way out of there. So how much of it is race versus how much of it is poverty?
It's both. It's both, Amy. It's really both. So when we think about our identities, we live those identities through race, class, gender, sexuality, all of it, mental health, geography, right? And so it's really both. Race becomes the biggest organizing principle for how people do in the United States, only because of racial slavery sets up a racial caste system. And caste just means, it's a big word, everybody, for hierarchy. It's a ladder. And that caste system continues even in our own time, even though we have Black people who have achieved great things. Those Black people on average are what Malcolm Gladwell calls outliers, meaning that yes, they have succeeded, they're brilliant, it's genius, but the norm, because of the caste system and because of systems, not because of behavior, not because of DNA, not because of biology. And we think about, there's historically been racism that we call eugenics. There's cultural racism that we say poor Black people are pathological, but poor single-headed households by white women are not, right? So it's so the white woman who might be in a trailer, a Black woman is in a housing project, and one of those is really dysfunctional. And it's not the teen mom who's white, it's the teen mom who's Black, but they basically have the same kind of life, but one is gonna have more chances, because in the caste system, even if you're white and poor and you're living in the trailer park, you're gonna have a different interface with the criminal justice system than your Black female counterpart. You're gonna have a different interface if you try to apply for loans and you try to apply for employment than your Black female counterpart. And we have the real social scientific evidence and data to prove this and to show this, and we've known it for a long time. So it really is all those things. It's race, it's class, it's gender, it's sexuality, but race becomes the organizing principle only because in our society, Amy, racial slavery and the caste system, the hierarchy it creates during antebellum slavery continues after. We had our chance, and I think now we have another chance. But we had our chance. We had chances during the first Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, and that's the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. End of racial slavery, except, as Ava DuVernay has shown, except in case of incarceration. The 14th Amendment is birthright citizenship, and the 15th is voting rights for Black men that then is going to be extended to women in 1920. The Civil Rights Movement is another opportunity through the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Brown desegregation decision, but we've never been able to get it quite right. They've continued, the caste system has just evolved. It's evolved where you do have certain Black CEOs or lawyers or entertainers or the former president, but then you have large gaps, right? And so the reason why Black people disproportionately are incarcerated is connected to what people are now calling systemic racism. Scholars usually call it institutional racism or structural racism, but since everybody's saying systemic, I'll say it too. Systemic racism. So these are systems, and I think people have to understand that it's very tough, even if you're trying to be on the straight and narrow and behave and do the right thing. And certainly, women have faced this too. Historically, white women have faced real sexism and deep misogyny. It's just that Black women then have sometimes Black women call it double jeopardy, sometimes triple jeopardy of race, class, and gender all simultaneously.
Right. And I can imagine, say, a Black woman with a disability would even be further down that line.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. She's going to be less likely just to have the access, right? The access, even if she's, again, the hard worker, bright, doing the whole thing. Because part of when you're caught up in systems and institutions start identifying you just based on the cast. So they don't say, hey, you are Amy Purdy. What people see is that, hey, she's a white woman, and they're going to act. The institution acts in that way. So if we were at like a big protest, just by the institution interfacing with you might say, hey, look, hands off her. But they look at me and they might not, no one's going to ask, hey, are you a professor at University of Texas? Are you that guy who I saw? No, they might really just read color and gender and then act accordingly. So that's why systems are really hard for individuals to sort of disaggregate themselves and say, hey, I'm one of the good ones. You're trying to tell the police officers, hey, I love the show Cops. I didn't want it to be canceled. Just and the baton is coming down your head, because the person is just reading just the color, and that's the whole thing about systemic racism. Yes.
And so okay, it kind of speaks on, and I have a question about the difference of the two between racism and, say, someone being a racist and just having biases, like you just have you've been trained a certain way, or you think a certain way.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of ingrained in our systems and
Yes.
how we're raised.
Yeah, there's a great book, Biased. I mean, we all have biases about the food we eat, the company we keep, and that's going to be different from racism. When you think about racism really speaks to institutions that treat different bodies differently based on race, based on physical characteristics. So when you think about racism, it could be something like Jim Crow segregation with white and colored signs, but it could be something like even as late as 2008-9, the mortgage industry gave certain set of loans to African Americans, even those who had the same qualifications as whites, that were worse than the white loans, and they called them mud loans, and they had to do a big settlement, and different banks had to do that, right? When you think about being a racist, I think that racism in the United States, and Ibram Kendi has the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, this idea that we're either anti-racist or racist. And racists are people who are either contributing to that project of racism, but I also think that, I agree with this idea that if you're not trying to actively be anti-racist, you sort of fall onto the other side in a de facto way. So being a racist is not being a Klan member and being this overt white supremacist from the movies. But racism is sort of sitting and basking in racial privilege that is connected to that racial caste system and those systems that oppress people, but thinking that you have nothing to do with their oppression, right? So it's really linked. So the so-called ghettos in the United States that are racially segregated, economically impoverished, they are linked to suburbs and parts of cities that are doing really, really well. They actually really literally are. There's a long history, and for people out there, there's a book called The Color of Law that's on the New York Times bestsellers list that looks at these by Richard Rothstein, that looks at these policies. There's a book called Race for Profit that looks at these policies. So, it's interesting that bias is something different than racism. And again, the whole idea to be racist, it's kind of like, in a way, that's a de facto setting for all people until they try to actively be anti-racist, just because of the way our society has been organized. And again, it's what I said at the beginning, it's just based on our history. We have Our history is not anybody else's history. So we could say that. It's very, very unique. Other places might have racial problems, but we are not England, we're not France, we're the United States of America. And we have a very, very specific history, you know, that even predates 1776, going back to 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. Yeah.
So I want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions. So keep asking your questions because we're going to get those answered for you. But while you're doing that, I want to ask one more question, which is, you know, so when we talk about race, like right now, there's a lot, of course, of talk on Black versus white. But when we talk about race, I mean, it's all colors in between. And so I'd be curious with, let's say, you know, the prison system, like is all of this inequality happening to, you know, if you have brown skin,
yeah,
you know, so it's not just Black and then white, but then you maybe somewhere in between have these other races that are involved as well that aren't, you know, a part of the good part of the system.
Yeah, no, so yes, it's happening to especially really, it's happening to Latinx and African American disproportionately. Native American, it's going to be different depending on where. There's 2 million Native Americans, most live outside of Native American reservations. I don't know the exact data on that, but it's going to be Latinx and African American. And when we think about that, that's a good pivot, because racism, the organizing principle of racism in the United States, because of our history, is anti-Black racism, and all the other racial groups are within that ladder, white at the top, Black at the bottom, and they're organizing themselves, Asian Americans, South Asians, Latinx, Indigenous, they're organizing themselves based on a knowledge that proximity to Blackness will make their lives worse. Whether that means living in Black neighborhoods, and I'm saying they're perceived that's going to make their lives worse. Some of it is you know, whether it's their friendship groups, whether it's going to a school that has Black people, or too many Black people, and you know, too many in air quotes, or proximity to whiteness is going to make their lives better, right? So there is anti-Latinx racism, but anti-brown racism isn't exactly anti-Black racism, and it really depends on Latinx. There's a difference between a Cuban American who reads as white and somebody who's from the Dominican Republic, or somebody who's from Guatemala, or somebody who's from Central America or South America who reads as Black. And sometimes you'll find those immigrants are in a real hurry to get out of the Black zone. It's almost like the Black zone is worse than the friendship zone. When people talk about the Black zone, it's, I don't want to be in that zone, right? It's worse than the friendship zone, where you're saying, hey, this is not where I want to be. I don't want to be. And so you're just running, you're running. And so that's why it's so important for us to understand that the first caste system was this idea of anti-Black racism. And it sort of makes sense why people are running, because Black people were the only racial group ever in American history who ever were legally considered chattel slavery, this species of property. This did not happen to Native people. It didn't happen to anybody else. It's real. And not only were they conceived as chattel property, what we did legally in the country, even though we understand now this was illegal and immoral, but we said all of their kin in perpetuity would be chattel property, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's why when we think about the Civil War, the reason why it's not a good thing to honor the Confederacy is that they were fighting and losing their lives to make that idea of generational chattel property something that lasted forever, right? And lately they've had the great quote from the Alexander Stevenson, the vice president of the Confederacy, who's saying, look, slavery is this great thing. It got us all this money, and Black people are supposed to be like this forever, you know? And so, and this wasn't just a debate. This is not something like where we're like, well, that's crazy. They had a debate over. This is a war. 700,000 people died. This is more people died in the Civil War than any of the wars we fought since. You know what I mean? Like, this is 700,000 people. It's like 1/7 of the population. It's crazy, right? But it's for this thing. And that's why, like, those of us who study history, we're not surprised at this, because until you confront this, it's always around us, right? It's like, we're in some ways, what we're trying to do is exorcise these ghosts, but in a lot of ways, we never want to confront it, right? We don't want to confront, well, what does it mean to say that you're naming a park after a Confederate general or a soldier? Like, what did they fight for again? And why do you think this was honorable? Like, what does this mean, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what Bryan Stevenson, he confronts a lot of that in Just Mercy, where he's in these courthouses and people are thinking he's a defendant. And they're, you know, the judge is saying, hey, boy, don't come here without your lawyer. I mean, right. he's in it. He's right in there. And these ghosts continue to haunt us.
Wow. I mean, you've touched on so many great topics today. I have so much to learn, you know, I have so much to learn.
We all do.
You know the basics, and you know what you know, and you know what you see. And this has certainly brought so much to the surface that, you know, that we all should have a better understanding of, you know?
No, that's great. And it's great that you're reading Just Mercy, but also seeing the film too, because I think the film is so powerful. Michael B. Jordan, Jamie Foxx, it's beautiful.
We wanted to do both because we knew that not everybody has the time to read the book. We wanted as much engagement as possible and participants as possible. So we definitely thought, you know, if you can't read the book, if you can just watch the movie, and the rest of the week, there's podcasts and kind of little bits and pieces that we're sharing as well that are, you know, helping to educate us as well. So, so Evan, have you been able to look at some of the questions here? And
we have a lot of really good questions. Certainly everyone wants to play their part and spring into action here. Maybe we end with that and kind of give some good takeaways for people to get into action. But first, we have a question from Lauren. What can be done to help young people in the criminal justice system? What forms specifically are necessary?
Yeah, a bunch of things. I mean, I think what you all are doing, raising money for the Equal Justice Initiative, is big. I think that you need a scaled down justice system, you know, not just diversionary programs, but we need to make prison and arrest, juvenile detention, putting kids in handcuffs, really not an option, not even just an option of last resort, but just not an option. We shouldn't have that kind of society. And the reason why those systems need to be demobilized, because we have this racist society, those systems are used to target Black and brown people. So until we can figure out a way to build a system that is not focused on targeting Black people, we have to really demobilize those systems. So we need to be thinking when we vote, when we provide our philanthropy, our civic activism, not in a mode of law and order, but in a mode of the beloved community. And how do we nurture and enrich people, even folks who are going to make mistakes? You know, Ella Baker, who's a great civil rights activist, said that until the sons and daughters of Black mothers were valued as much as the sons and daughters of white mothers, that we who believe in freedom would not rest, right? And that's where we have to go. And part of that requires dismantling systems that we might think provide us safety and security, but we realize that they only do so based on the color of our skin. That you know, and this is all tough to confront, because I understand the narrative of American history that we've all been given, and we embrace that narrative. We want to love our country, and for those of us who do anti-racist work, we do love the country. But you have a criticism because you understand what's wrong and the shortcomings of the country, right? So this is all critical root work, and I think one of the things we have to do with these kids is not turn Black kids into adults just because of our racial fear, because that's what we do. And that's what Bryan Stevenson said. You lose your youth. You're 9, 10, 11. You're a boy, you're a girl, you're too big, you're too tall, you're too sassy. This is all negative stuff. This is all negative stuff. So we rob and we traumatize these Black kids who learn very quickly not to be in this white neighborhood. You can't go shopping. And let's face it, kids make mistakes. White kids shoplift too. It's just not a death sentence. White kids smoke marijuana. They do. Our kids make mistakes. That's kind of the point of growing up, and the point of birth is that you're trying things and you're making mistakes, right? So who you are at 9 is not who you are at 19. and 29 and 40. It's not. And so part of it is that we've got to dismantle systems that are trying to punish our kids because they don't like the way our kids look. And they connect that racism, they explain it away by saying it was our kids' fault. Our kids misbehaved. It was our kids. Our kids are angry, right? But all kids misbehave, right? And they should all be given mercy, right? And remember, when you raise kids, it's not just second chance, they get infinite chances. That's what being a parent means. There's not a million, there's no tally. There's no tally. Your kid gets infinite chances until you die, because your kids, you want and pray to outlive you. So you're forgiving them on your deathbed. They're like, sorry, Dad. You're like, I forgive you and I love you. That's what you do with your kids. That's the narrative with your kids. I forgive you, I love you, and I'm sorry. Those are the three.
So let me drill into that a little bit. So we got some questions on this. So in terms of dismantling some of these systems, and of course, there's things we can do in terms of, changing minimum sentencing and things like that. But in terms of defunding the police is a topic that got raised in a couple of questions here. What do you think? What kind of impact will that have? Is that the right approach? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, no, I'm a prison abolitionist, and I do agree with defund the police as a reimagining of law enforcement. What you mean by that is doesn't mean there'd be no law enforcement. You're saying you're gonna fund public education, fund healthcare. You're gonna get rid of homelessness. You're gonna have mental health and environmental safety, clean water, no asbestos, no lead poisoning for everybody. And you're gonna have the first responders be people who don't have guns, okay? First responders be people, women and men who don't have guns, community caretakers and weavers. So that and one thing I'll tell everybody out there, just like people are criticizing this term defund the police and prison abolition, I want everyone to know as a historian, people criticize the abolition of slavery and using the term abolition. I just want us to understand, that's the kind of society we're in. When people say, guess what? I'm for abolishing slavery, many people said, you are too radical. And we had white allies. And some of our white allies got killed alongside of Black abolitionists. So when we've asked for voting rights for Black people and for women, people said, you are crazy. This is absolutely crazy. When we've said civil rights and human rights and racial integration, people have said, you are crazy. When we've said trans rights and gay marriage and queer rights, and when we tried to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we tried to pass it decades before it passed, people said, this is crazy. Why do you need cutouts for wheelchairs? Why do you need that? So we have to remember, until we mainstream social justice, people say, this is crazy, until it becomes the new normal. So we have to, and again, the biggest thing we can have is the courage of our convictions. And that's what we see with Bryan Stevenson. We have to have huge, huge courage when you care about people who are outside of your family zone, your friendship zone, and you say that your kinship network and your moral circle is as large as the universe, is as large as the country, as large as the world, then you have to be very brave and very strong, because not everybody's moral universe is that large.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. Thank you so much. Okay, last question. Getting more into action here. So Jeannie asked, how do we all contribute and play a role beyond marching, learning, speaking up? Are there things we should focus on as it seems and feels unsurmountable?
Oh yeah, wherever you're at, you should focus and invest in anti-racist organizations. I run a Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, which will, I'm sure we'll put the link or something up there. But wherever you're at locally, Evan, you're in Chicago, wherever you're at, I think, and it's not just the NAACP, Equal Justice Initiative, Color of Change, Legal Defense Fund, all things I agree with, but small local nonprofits, some connected to university, some connected to just the community. I would urge you to invest in those that are Black-led. If you're part of corporate America, use your voice to amplify Black-led anti-racism. Use your voice. Find out the story and tell your children the story so they can be allies too. Tell your churches and your civic networks the story. One of the things we can all do, none of our neighborhoods are racially diverse enough. Find out how many people in your city are Black or brown, and see what can you do for your children's schools, your neighborhood, your faith communities, to get those people to be a part of that community, right? Leverage your supply chain of power and privilege, and really blunt that supply chain of misery and grief that so many communities of color, and especially Black communities, are caught up in. And then finally, you know, Evan and Amy, when we think about this, I challenge everybody to go beyond diversity and inclusion and equity, and think about Black equity and Black equality. And what does that mean? One of the things, I wrote a book on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., and I make the argument that they're talking about Black dignity and citizenship. And what does that mean? It means a world where we don't have anti-Black racial violence. It means a world with no segregation. But it also means a world with not just the end of racial oppression, but the appearance of justice. What does that look like? Universal basic income. It looks like decent housing. It looks like equitable education. And it looks, I keep mentioning this, desegregation, desegregation, desegregation. So we can all do our work beyond voting, beyond all this really high level activism, which we must do. This really has to be deeply empathetic, but also action oriented. We can have social impact. And again, Amy has a huge voice in terms of disability activism, connecting that to anti-racism and Black folks in the disability community. Hugely powerful. You have such a big, big voice, so impactful. So that's what we need. We need to braid these things together. And I think one of the best aspects of where we're at now, Black Lives Matter has been talking about Black trans lives. And tens of thousands marching. Can you believe it? You know, and it doesn't mean that we don't still have a community across the United States that's homophobic, transphobic, that's non-able-bodied phobic, but that we're centering these finally and saying we are going to build a new America that has this new consensus where all people are equal. And saying all people are equal, the reason you say Black Lives Matter is that you know that Black lives have not mattered and been part of that consensus. That's why. So of course you say all people matter, but you know who's not been part of the consensus, including Black trans women who are missing and murdered at these extraordinary rates. And if they mattered, they would not be. You know, we don't kill people and have people missing who don't matter, who matter rather, right? So we know what we have to do. And now the onus is on all of us to do it, to roll up our sleeves, to do that hard work. But I'm very hopeful, and definitely thank you both for your leadership in making this possible.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Go ahead, Amy, sorry.
I just, you know, I have so many thoughts going through my mind and so many things I want to share. And first of all, thank you so much. Really, you speak so well, and you hit every topic and every question that I had. So I appreciate your time so much. And you know, well, first of all, I want to say one thing with kind of weaving the different kind of issues together. We are now apparently entering Black Disability Awareness Month, because the Disability Awareness Month is coming up, and now they've kind of overlapped, which is awesome. Amazing. And I'll tell you, I actually haven't done enough research within like the disabled community, and because in a way I got my legs and I kind of went, and I very much so fit into the normal world. But after this injury that I faced this year, I'm certainly dealing with what kind of challenges people with disabilities face, and I've faced all of them this year. And to think that, yes, if the color of my skin changed the type of care that I got, certainly I would not be where I'm at today, and that shouldn't be happening. So there's a lot more work that I can be doing that I'm already connected to. I just need to learn more about. And I think so much of what you shared, you know, you keep going back to empathy, and it's so important. And one thing that you said that struck me was just, you know, casting your moral circle to be as big as the country, be as big as the universe, not just your family and your friends, but start to really look at, you know, at like how we're all doing, how are we all doing, and what can we be doing better, and how can we contribute to that versus being blind to it And I agree that when you're blind to it and you're not aware of it, you automatically fall into the racist side because you're certainly not doing anything to change it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I've just taken so much away, and once again, thank you so much. And I've got a lot more work to do than what I've done. So I'm looking forward to doing that.
That's great. We all do. We all do.
Yeah, we all do, for certain. Well, thank you both for taking the time and creating the space for this discussion. Thank you to everyone that joined tonight. We will be sending out a recording of this talk where you can tune in and watch it again. We'll also include links to Dr. Joseph and his work so you can continue to learn, like it sounds like we all are going to. So thank you again, Dr. Joseph. I really, really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Amy.